blind, have low vision, or have another print disability which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Julian Wong, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the Sunday, January 18th, 2026 issue of the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. In Minnesota, two stark views about a victim. A rural-urban divide reflected at a bar. Nisswa, Minnesota. The regulars file into Ye Old Pickle Factory in Nisswa before 10 a.m. most days, taking their seats at the bar. Chili pepper lights hang from the ceiling, and neon beer signs glow against wood-paneled walls. A television flickers on. The Price is Right is about to start. They have been doing this since the mid-1980s, gathering in this small, dim room, waiting for someone on the game show to spin exactly $1 on the big wheel. When that happens, everyone receives a token for a free drink. Lately, they had been in a lull. No one had hit the dollar in weeks, until Wednesday. Nisswa is a town of about 2,000 people in the Brainerd Lakes area, a popular summer vacation destination about 150 miles north of Minneapolis. Most of the regulars on hand this morning say they prefer not to go to the city anymore. Not since the summer of 2020, when George Floyd was murdered by a police officer and the city erupted. Now, Minneapolis is in the news again. An immigration and customs enforcement agent shot and killed a woman, Renee Good, during an immigration operation on January 7th, and demonstrators are back on the streets. What did the regulars make of it? Miss Good's death was tragic, they said, horrific. But they also said that she had asked for trouble. You obey the law, officer, a man in a veteran's ball cap said, and question it later. This is the divide, in a single sentence. In Minneapolis, protesters saw an innocent woman killed by a federal agent and took to the streets. At The Pickle, the regulars saw a woman who should have complied. In bars, cafes, and coffee shops across rural Minnesota, the same conversations were unfolding. Miss Good's death had become a mirror, reflecting back a fracture that had been deepening for years, not just in their state, but across the country, wherever rural areas chafe against the political power of big cities. Deb Lund and Connie Jensen, both in their early 70s, sat at the bar. A Busch Light cooler nearby read Welcome Hunters. A patron had brought smoked salmon to share, and someone passed a Tupperware container down the line. This area, like most of rural Minnesota, votes solidly Republican. It was not always this way. For decades, rural Minnesota was home to moderate Democrats, who would vote for candidates from their own party who aligned with their views. The rightward shift was catalyzed by the rise of Donald J. Trump. Now the regulars at The Pickle say that what everyone in the region seems to agree on is that life there is safer and quieter than in the Twin Cities. Most of the regulars avoid Minneapolis if they can. They see the city as dangerous, out of control, and something to flee. I don't even want to go there, Miss Jensen said of Minneapolis. Not anymore. Not since the George Floyd riots. Miss Lund used to live in Crystal, a Minneapolis suburb. I worked my butt off to get up here, she said, and there's no way I'm going back. The regulars once bristled when Governor Tim Walz, a Democrat, referred to rural Minnesota as the land of rocks and cows. Now they call themselves Rocks and Cows with a kind of pride. It's a hopeless feeling, Miss Jensen said, that most everything is controlled by the city. There is a term for what Miss Lund and Miss Jensen are expressing. Christopher Federico, a professor of political science and psychology at the University of Minnesota, calls it rural consciousness, a sense that living in a rural area comes with consequences, less political power, fewer resources, and less respect. One thing we find is that individuals who are high in rural consciousness feel misunderstood by people living in non-rural areas, Professor Federico said. To some extent, there's evidence they feel shortchanged. There is nothing uniquely Minnesotan about this. The same fault lines run through Illinois, California, New York, anywhere a major metropolis dominates state politics, as it is in Minnesota by the Twin Cities. Rural citizens have become more conservative and more Republican across the country. But in Minnesota, the shift has been particularly pronounced. Today, less populated areas of the state vote Republican by a margin of roughly 2-1, according to Tim Lindberg, an associate professor of political science at the University of Minnesota, Morris, who studies rural politics. This sense of alienation is not new, but in recent years it has become tightly bound to Republican partisanship, a shift accelerated by conservative media and political leaders who frame cities as dangerous and lawless. At the Pickle, neither Miss Lund nor Miss Jensen had seen President Trump's recent social media post calling for a day of reckoning. A day of reckoning and retribution in Minnesota. I like the reckoning part, Miss Jensen said when told of the post. As for retribution, she had a target in mind: the allegations of fraud in Minnesota's child care and nutrition programs that federal prosecutors have been investigating. The protesters filling the streets of Minneapolis after Miss Good was killed. Miss Jensen wondered aloud about that. Do you think they're paid, she said. But elsewhere, in rural Minnesota, the shooting had unsettled even some conservatives. In Pine City, about 75 miles north of Minneapolis, Trevor DePop, 23, helps manage a pro shop that screens jerseys for local sports teams. He considers himself a Republican. He supports ICE. He is also troubled by the killing. I don't think the shooting was necessarily 100% justified, Mr. DePop said. I can see both sides of it. Obviously, when you drive into someone that has a gun pointed, that's probably not the smartest idea. But at the same time, why do you have a gun pulled in that situation? And then to walk away on your body cam and be using foul language toward the person. I think it's great to start to get some of the illegal immigrants out of the state, he added. I think it's bad how they're going about it. Mr. DePop had never seen any ICE agent in town. He said many residents see the Twin Cities, also known as the cities in these parts, as almost another world. Until something happens up here, it's not a problem for anyone up here, he said. A lot of people don't watch the news anymore because all you see is stuff that happens in the cities. It's depressing, traumatizing. It's things that we don't think about until it happens up here, but down in the cities it happens every day. Mary Kay Brodigan, 74, a retired local real estate agent and a member of a local liberal activist group called the Blue Brigade, has a different view. She said she had been haunted by Miss Good's last words captured on video. I can't sleep at night because of that soundbite in my head, she said. Dude, we're not trying to hurt you. That's how we feel. Dudes, we're not trying to hurt you when we are out there. Minnesota is under attack right now, she added. Seriously under attack. And I don't know what the defense is other than to keep standing for what we believe in. Nancy Mock, 79, another Blue Brigade member who was a retired dean of student affairs at a local community college, says navigating the small divide in the small town required care. In Pine City, she sees the same people every day, including friends she plays trivia with on Thursday nights. They're fun, you know, she said. It's just that you have to avoid the political piece, which is too bad because we're not going to learn from others by avoiding it. But it's the only way we can exist right now. Back at the Pickle, Lanny Thompson knows that delicate dance well. Miss Thompson has been tending bar there for 40 years. She has lived in Nisswa since she was 10. The regulars recently threw her an anniversary party. She is a lifelong Democrat. They are, by and large, Republicans. She calls them family. It's a mutual respect, Miss Thompson said. They don't talk real bad when I'm around, and I choose not to fight with them. Before ICE arrived in the state, she said, her customers talked about what they were making for dinner, where the fish were biting, or how Connie's quilts were coming along. These are people who take care of each other. A customer brings smoked salmon for others to share. The regulars throw their Democratic bartender a party. They organize gatherings for National Soup Day, the Fall Fling, and National Pickle Day. Miss Jensen and her husband leave for lunch every day, Miss Thompson said. But they often return near the end of her shift to say goodbye. Attention turned to the television. The contestants were about to spin the wheel for the Showcase Showdown. 150 miles to the south, protesters were following ICE vehicles through the streets of Minneapolis. How activists in Iran combat web blackout, sneaking in thousands of Starlink terminals. Iran's communications blackout seemed complete. Internet and cellular networks had been shut down by the authorities. Online banking, shopping, and text messaging services stopped working. Information about the growing protests was scarce. Yet a ragtag network of activists, developers, and engineers pierced Iran's digital barricades. Using thousands of Starlink satellite internet systems that they had quietly smuggled into the country, they got online and spread images of troops firing into the streets and families searching for bodies. Their actions, described by digital rights researchers and others, forced Iran's government to respond. The authorities deployed military-grade electronic weaponry designed to disrupt the GPS signals that Starlink equipment need to function, a step that activists and civil society groups said was rarely taken outside battlefields like those in Ukraine. The cracks exposed in Iran's internet shutdown were no accident. Since 2022, activists and civil society groups have worked on sneaking Starlink terminals into the country, aided by a U.S. government sanctions exemption for Starlink and American companies to offer communication tools in Iran. About 50,000 of the terminals are now in Iran, according to digital activists, in defiance of an Iranian law passed last year that bans the system and of rules prohibiting unlicensed services. You need a plan to have that infrastructure in place, said Faridoon Bashar, the executive director of ASL 19, a digital rights group focused on Iran. This is because of years of planning and work among different groups. The hidden networks of Starlinks and the Iranian government's aggressive response against them shows how national digital blackouts are becoming harder for authorities to enforce. Governments have long used internet disruptions to suppress dissent in countries like India, Myanmar, and Uganda. But the spread of tools like satellite internet have complicated the shutdowns and created a cat and mouse hunt against new technologies. Starlink, provided by Elon Musk's rocket company SpaceX, beams an internet connection from satellites to terminals on Earth. bypassing any land-based censorship infrastructure. That has helped the service play an outsized role in Iran's protests, helping demonstrators organize and communicate with the outside world. Starlink is still available to only a sliver of the Iranian population, and information about the protests, which have left an estimated 3,000 dead, remains limited. For most people, the internet continues to be heavily restricted, even as some domestic services have reopened. Video game services have removed chat options, while e-commerce platforms have blocked messaging features, researchers said, an effort to keep the economy going while limiting communication. This is the most severe internet shutdown that we have experienced, said Ahmad Ahmadian, an exiled activist who was also involved in smuggling the satellite internet systems into Iran. Starlink is a lifeline. The reliance on Starlink underscores Mr. Musk's geopolitical influence. Last week, the world's richest man said all Starlink services in Iran would be free of charge. President Trump has also emphasized the importance of satellite internet technology. A SpaceX spokesman could not be reached for comment. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. In most internet shutdowns worldwide, governments order local internet service providers to turn off access. Other techniques that filter internet data allow authorities to more narrowly target what connections are cut. In 2024, there were 296 internet shutdowns in 54 countries, the most on record, according to the rights group Access Now. Iran has long been a practitioner of internet blackouts, with its online censorship system considered one of the most sophisticated in the world outside China. The government has built a state-run internet, the National Information Network, which is essentially walled off from the rest of the world. The authorities tightly control access to global internet content while providing smooth connections for approved domestic services like banking, shopping, transportation, and entertainment. When the need arises, Iran's government has surgically cut off the internet in some areas, while still giving access to essential online services, Internet Monitors said. Its system is not perfect, and many Iranians have used virtual private networks, known as VPNs, and other tools to use Instagram and other global services. But on January 8th, as mass protests swelled, Iranian officials turned off the internet altogether, sending the country of 90 million people into a digital blackout. VPNs stopped working, Iran's internet traffic dropped 99%, according to NetBlocks, a monitoring group. The government panicked, said Amir Rashidi, a cybersecurity expert with Mian, a digital rights group focused on Iran. Activists who had prepared for a communications blockade swung into action. After the authorities shut down the internet during violent protests in 2022, activists and civil society groups hatched plans to smuggle in Starlinks from neighboring countries. The State Department coordinated with SpaceX on the sanctions exemption for digital communication tools in Iran. It also provided support to civil society groups about how to hide the systems from government detection, according to a Biden administration official involved in the plans. Activating Starlink, Mr. Musk posted online that year about Iran. Mr. Ahmadian, now executive director of the rights group Holistic Resilience in Los Angeles, said he had helped others get some of the first Starlink terminals across the border. We turned it on and it just worked like a charm, he said. Encouraged by the success, Mr. Ahmadian said he helped build a smuggling network. Clustering on Telegram channels and other online platforms, merchants sold Starlink units and coordinated delivery routes through the United Arab Emirates, Iraqi Kurdistan, Armenia, and Afghanistan. Before the latest protests, it cost $700 to $800 to smuggle a Starlink terminal into Iran. Mr. Ahmadian said, "A black market emerged for people seeking access to Instagram, YouTube, and other restricted platforms, mainly among more wealthy Iranians," he added. The roughly 50,000 Starlink terminals now in Iran are hidden on rooftops in discrete locations. Developers have built tools so a Starlink connection can be shared, turning a single terminal into a gateway for others farther away. The Iranian government was aware of Starlink's growing presence, but did not do much to curtail the use until recently, said Doug Midori, an internet infrastructure expert with the network analysis firm Kentik. The latest electronic jamming efforts against Starlink worked in certain areas, but the terminals are too numerous and dispersed to block completely, researchers said. An Israeli intelligence official said Iran's government appeared to focus on blocking Starlink terminals in neighborhoods close to the largest universities, to force students offline. The authorities have flown drones to find the Starlink units, activists said. They also tried to invoke fear by broadcasting the confiscation of the satellite terminals and warning that possession of a Starlink is a crime. The situation in Iran with satellite internet systems is a litmus test for electronic warfare in the civilian environment, said Thomas Withington, a military communications expert at the Royal United Services Institute. Access to satellite communications used to be for the military. That paradigm is changing. Several activists said Starlink had been vital, but they were concerned that Mr. Musk might one day change his mind and turn off the service. In authoritarian countries where Mr. Musk has business interests, like China, he has said the service is unavailable. Reality check on weight loss drugs. You may need one forever. Weight loss drugs like Wegovy require a lifetime commitment. Stop taking them, and you'll almost always gain back the weight you lost. But many patients don't want to hear that. Dr. Padmaja Akireddy, an endocrinologist at Nebraska Medicine, estimated that more than half of her patients don't want to stay on a weight loss drug long term. And data shows that most Americans quit the drugs within a year of starting them. Even Oprah Winfrey said that she stopped taking a weight loss drug cold turkey for a year, then gained back 20 pounds. "I tried to beat the medication," she told People magazine. It was then that she realized it's going to be a lifetime thing, she told the magazine. Many people have stopped taking the drugs because they can no longer afford them. Others grow tired of side effects like fatigue and constipation. Some just don't want to rely on a drug forever. Frequently, patients believe they will be the exception, said Dr. Michelle Hauser, the obesity medicine director of the Stanford Lifestyle and Weight Management Center. They seem to think, that's not going to be me. I'm not going to take them forever, Dr. Hauser said. Medical authorities at the highest level have pushed that misconception. Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., for one, has said weight loss drugs can allow people to reset, suggesting they are a temporary bridge, not a long-term tool. But research has repeatedly shown that most people need to stay on the drugs to maintain weight loss or other health benefits. This month, the latest big study to demonstrate people regain weight showed that the average person who used weight loss drugs returned to their starting weight around a year and a half after stopping them. People who go off the medications typically follow a pattern. When the medication wears off, food cravings and appetite can surge back. And, as with any diet regimen, when people lose a lot of weight quickly, their metabolism slows down, raising the risk they will regain weight. Even people who attempt to maintain a careful regimen of diet and exercise after going off the drugs can struggle to keep the weight off. It's not impossible, but it is extremely difficult. Dr. Hauser estimates that fewer than 10 of her patients have successfully kept off 75% or more of the weight they lost after going on a GLP-1, without turning to another weight loss medication or undergoing bariatric surgery. Those are people that are working out 2 hours a day, tracking what they're eating. They're really working hard, she said. I haven't had anyone that just tapers off, isn't really putting that much thought into it, and just keeps the weight off. I've never seen that happen. Because people frequently lose muscle on weight loss drugs, when they do regain weight, it is often in the form of fat, Dr. Hauser said. That means that if people cycle on and off these medications, they can end up being essentially less healthy, even at the same or a slightly lower weight than before they started the drugs. In many cases, patients want to stay on the medications, but have to go off the drugs when their insurance stops covering them. In many cases, patients want to stay on those medications, including Jeremy Bush, 53, who was effectively forced to stop taking Ozempic this past fall. He is pre-diabetic, and his insurance company moved to cover the medication only for people with type 2 diabetes. Over 6 months on the medication, he had lost around 40 pounds, and his blood sugar levels were improving. But when he went off the drug, he was hungry again, furiously and constantly. In the 2 weeks after he stopped the medication, he regained around 15 pounds. I just told myself I can't do this, he said. After about a month's interruption, he decided to get back on Ozempic, this time paying for it himself. Some patients don't want to take that risk and decide it is worth it to stay on the drug long term. Ariel Newman, 34, started Wegovy in 2023 after she gained weight during law school and while treating a thyroid condition. After about 4 months, she had lost 25 pounds. Maybe you'll go off it, she recalled her doctor at the time saying. Miss Newman wasn't convinced. For the first time that I can remember since childhood, I have so much mental capacity for other things, Miss Newman said. Why wouldn't I stay on it, she added. Part of why Miss Newman wanted to continue taking the medication is a growing body of evidence that these drugs have health benefits beyond weight loss. Wegovy and Ozempic have been shown to reduce the risk of heart issues independent of how much weight they lose, and to improve kidney and liver disease. Even if someone is no longer losing weight while on these drugs, the medication may still confer cardiovascular and other benefits, said Dr. Nils Kruger, a researcher at Harvard Medical School. Last month, the World Health Organization released new guidelines suggesting that adults with obesity should stay on them long term to maintain weight loss. Currently, there are no guidelines for de-prescribing these medications. Doctors are caught in a de facto experiment, trying to modulate between patients' desires or financial need to stop taking the drugs and the reality that they will most likely gain back weight when they do. You ask 5 different obesity medicine doctors, you get 5 different answers, Dr. Hauser said. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Intervention is a gamble Trump takes. Buoyed by successes, but risks remain. President Trump has put some big bets on the table, all at once. He is gambling that he can exploit his control of Venezuela's oil resources, even if the chief executive of ExxonMobil believes, from bitter experience, the oil industry there remains uninvestable. At the same moment, he thinks he may be able to crush Cuba, cutting off the fuel and the funding it got from Venezuela. He is actively urging protesters in Iran to overthrow the government. In a social media post last week, he told Iranians to take over your institutions, embracing their calls for freedom despite the fact that his national security strategy says little about supporting pro-democracy movements and urges a focus on the Western Hemisphere, not the Middle East. Mr. Trump appears newly emboldened, buoyed by the seeming success of striking Iran's nuclear sites and sending an Army Delta Force team in to seize Nicolas Maduro from his bed. If Mr. Trump is successful, and if his luck holds, the world may look back at these remarkable few months as a burst of American interventionism and say that Mr. Trump managed to bury Iran's nuclear program in rubble and oversaw the fall of a repressive regime in Venezuela as well as Iran and Cuba. Of course, wiping out repressive regimes and ushering in a new era of freedom for people in different parts of the world are not part of Mr. Trump's national security strategy. In the first year of his administration, Mr. Trump dismantled the instruments of soft power, such as Voice of America and the State Department unit that dropped internet capability into Iran, that were key to democracy promotion. Nonetheless, there is a new argument brewing among some Republicans in Washington. They say that despite the MAGA credo that Washington should avoid foreign entanglements, an exception can be carved out for getting rid of repressive leaders who once shouted death to America. It would be less than a 1989 moment when the Berlin Wall fell. 2 years later, the Soviet Union dissolved. But it could mark a collapse of some of the most active of America's second-tier adversaries. Mr. Trump has certainly left himself plenty of room for maximal intervention, in Tehran, Caracas, and beyond, even to seize Greenland. In a social media post last week, he doubled down on that goal, declaring that the United States must own the island because it is vital for the Golden Dome that we are building, a reference to a still nascent plan for a missile defense system that would cover the United States. It was all a vivid reminder that in his New York Times interview this month, Mr. Trump declared that the only limits to his powers as commander-in-chief were my own morality and my own mind. Since the interview, Mr. Trump has indicated he is all in to encourage an uprising in Iran. He wrote on social media on Tuesday that help is on its way, to the anti-regime protesters, seeming to dismiss words of caution from those who warn that the United States risks playing into the hands of the mullahs, who want to portray the uprising as American-inspired. Iranian patriots, keep protesting. Take over your institutions, Mr. Trump wrote. The question is how many of these interventions have come off for this to be a success. Asked James Arroyo, the director of the Ditchley Foundation, which convenes discussions among foreign policy experts on global challenges. Not all, he concluded, but some. But events could also roll the other way. It is possible, a year from now, that Venezuela is still a mess with relatively little new oil production capability, or that Mr. Maduro's authoritarian appointees are still repressing dissent, that the play to choke off Cuba's lifeline and bring down its government fails, and that Iran's mullahs slip away, again, remaining in charge in Tehran, even if just barely. Already, the street protests in Iran appear to have largely stopped after thousands of demonstrators were detained or killed in a crushing government crackdown. Of course, there are a host of other potential wildcards, each with risks to the president. Russia's war on Ukraine could still be grinding on, despite Mr. Trump's confident-sounding declarations over the past few months that President Vladimir Putin of Russia wants to make a deal. Even some of his close advisors, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio, have publicly said otherwise. And after a flurry of activity over sending a new proposal for a peace deal to Moscow weeks ago, Mr. Trump has gone quiet on the topic. If Mr. Trump is widely perceived to have sold out Ukraine, essentially paving the way for Russia to take part of the country and threaten a reinvasion of the West, it would hardly play to his new interest in fighting for the freedom of the oppressed in adversarial countries. Similarly, if he failed to protect Taiwan, he would run the same risk. And whatever gains Mr. Trump makes as a late-in-life convert to fighting for the freedom of the oppressed could be overshadowed by his burning desire to take over Greenland. Speaking to the Times this month, he seemed more determined than ever to take the giant island, which would be the largest single territorial gain for the United States in history. Mr. Trump appears to know this. Walking around the Oval Office in the Cabinet Room, he pointed out a painting of James K. Polk, who he noted presided over the expansion of the United States to California in the era of Manifest Destiny. To other NATO nations, Mr. Trump's demand to own Greenland sounds more like imperialism than interventionism. Mr. Trump isn't making an argument that Greenlanders have been oppressed by Denmark. While there are tensions between the 57,000 or so residents of the Frozen Isle and the Danish government nation that protects their territory and has an outsized influence on their budget and politics, the relationship is largely amicable. Yet, Mr. Trump made clear that if he had to choose between expanding America's footprint and preserving the Atlantic Alliance, he is likely to choose the former. One way or the other, we're going to have Greenland, he told reporters on Air Force One last week, one of several statements the Chinese government has leaped upon to accuse Mr. Trump of grabbing territory, exactly what Washington used to say about China's moves in the South China Sea. Then, there is the other risk to Mr. Trump, that long-range, remote-control efforts to control other nations turn out to be a lot harder than bombing the Fordo nuclear enrichment site, or shooting through the layers of Cuban and Venezuelan guards protecting Mr. Maduro. Some who have had top U.S. military roles worry Mr. Trump may not appreciate the lessons of past efforts at control and occupation of foreign societies. The road to disappointment for presidents who become enamored with low-cost, risk-free, covert, surgical, or other enticing ways to use force is well documented, said General Stanley A. McChrystal, who ran the Joint Special Operations Command from the 2003 Iraq invasion until 2008. Rarely has a covert operation, air power, or a coup de main ended a conflict, he said. We are in a period where America's ability to intimidate, punish, and coerce our enemies and allies seems unlimited, he added. But it is not. At some point, I believe the reality is that security comes from military capability, but even more from relationships, alliances, mature diplomacy, and credibility on the world stage. Perhaps so, but when pressed during his interview about lessons from past occupations, Japan in 1945 or Iraq in 2003, Mr. Trump quickly turned the conversation back to discrete, tactical military operations. On his desk, he keeps a model of the B-2 bomber that was used in the strikes on Iranian nuclear sites, a remarkable tactical success that buried much of Iran's nuclear fuel and diminished its nuclear program. And he marveled that the United States seized Mr. Maduro without a single American combat death, and few severe American casualties. But now comes the long, hard haul. If he is truly in charge of Venezuela, as Mr. Trump has repeatedly declared, he will ultimately be held responsible for how long it takes to boost the country's oil production capacity, and how the resulting revenues are distributed. He hinted the other day that he was inclined to cut ExxonMobil out of the U.S. program there because I didn't like Exxon's response on whether it was a worthwhile investment. They're playing too cute, he told reporters. If he is successful in backing the protesters in Iran, he will have to decide how deeply to involve the United States in the emergence of a new government. That would most likely bring comparisons to the 1950s, when the CIA staged a coup under the direction of Kermit Roosevelt Jr., an American intelligence officer and a grandson of another famous interventionist, Theodore Roosevelt, whose portrait hangs near Mr. Trump's desk. Demolitions in Nigeria bring evictions and several deaths. Lagos, Nigeria. Residents of a 19th century fishing community nicknamed the Venice of Nigeria have been left homeless after a government eviction that sent excavators to carry out demolitions. Leaders in the community, Makoko, and two nearby settlements say that at least 10,000 people have lost their homes during a demolition process that began in late December. Makoko leaders and humanitarian groups said that at least 4 people had died during the demolitions. Among them were 2 infants and a 70-year-old woman who they said suffered respiratory issues after tear gas was fired to scatter families trying to protect their homes. A spokesman for the Lagos state government declined to comment on the reports of deaths and pointed to several news stories citing the government's position that the demolition was necessary for safety, to move residents away from a nearby power line that could someday fall, and for urban planning. State officials and private entities have engaged in numerous efforts in recent years to clear areas in the name of development in Lagos, a sprawling megacity of about 20 million people. Residents say informal communities in the city are sometimes given little or no warning before being ordered to evacuate. Families settled in the 1800s in Makoko. They live in small shacks on stilts in the lagoon, where they make a living catching and smoking fish, sold at many markets in the city. The largely impoverished area, which residents reach by canoe, is on display for commuters traveling across a busy bridge. Last year, state government officials told Makoko residents that homes could not exist within 30 meters of the power line, which stretches across Lagos Lagoon. Officials later extended the distance to 100 meters. Residents agreed to comply and planted a Nigerian flag in the water at what they said was the 100-meter mark. But as amphibious excavators began work, the machines ripped down homes well past the flag, they said. Non-profit groups working with residents used aerial photos to estimate that the excavators had torn down homes as far as 500 meters from the power line. On a recent morning, a yellow excavator reduced homes and fishing shacks to piles of splintered boards, plastic bowls, crab shells, and clothing. Some panicked residents preemptively began destroying their own homes, collecting planks and sheets of tin in narrow wooden canoes, hoping to rebuild elsewhere. Isaac Atamato, 15, was threading his canoe through the inky water to get to a pile of broken planks. "This was my house," he said, looking at what was left of a 2-story shack where he said 12 members of his family had lived. He ran when he saw the excavator heading for his home and was left barefoot, with only the shirt and pants he was wearing after it was demolished. He has been sleeping on the wet, dirty floor of his narrow canoe with his brother. He said he was unsure where his family will live. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Trump's fight in Minnesota is about more than immigration. Minneapolis. There are plenty of obvious reasons Minneapolis, despite ranking far down the list of U.S. cities in terms of its immigrant population, is the latest Democratic-led urban area targeted by President Trump's punitive anti-immigration raids. There is Tim Walz, the governor, and Mr. Trump's 2024 rival. There is the genuinely stunning fraud scandal, recently revealed, that happened on Mr. Walz's watch. And there is the long shadow of George Floyd. But to understand both the crackdown and its stakes, it's also worth revisiting a speech Mr. Trump gave in the city in November 2016, 2 days before the election that would deliver him his first win to the White House. "Oh, Minnesota," Mr. Trump told the crowd, dropping into the just you and me talking mode that has always been one of his greatest assets as a politician. "You know what's going on. You know what I'm talking about. Do you know what I'm talking about? Be politically correct. Just nod, quietly nod. The whole world knows what's happening in Minnesota." What was happening in Minnesota then was a slow-burning tension surrounding the state's Somali community, its second largest immigrant population. In 2008, a young Somali-born man from Minneapolis was recruited by the Somali Islamist militant group Al-Shabaab and detonated a car full of explosives outside a government building in his birth country's Puntland region, the first of dozens of young men from the community who would fight for Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and later for the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria over the next decade. Minnesota had been a haven for refugees since after World War II, when it was an early destination for Holocaust survivors in the United States, and especially since the late 1970s, when it began taking in thousands of South Vietnamese and Hmong people on the wrong side of America's withdrawal from Southeast Asia. This hospitality had historically been a point of pride for the state, a piece of the exceptionalism that Minnesotans, performatively modest as they are, have always claimed. It was a product of a broader, deep-rooted civic idealism, the state's preponderance of religious charities, community-level nonprofit organizations, and in particular its Nordic-style social safety net, among the most generous in the country. But amid the Al-Shabaab and ISIS recruitment, Minnesotans had grown ambivalent. A 2014 poll found that while the state's residents were broadly supportive of immigration, less than half supported welcoming Somali immigrants. At an October 2015 listening session in the small city of St. Cloud, where tensions had run particularly high, the state's Democratic governor, Mark Dayton, addressed the Somali community. "This is Minnesota, and you have every right to be here," he said. The state, he said, was not like it was 30, 50 years ago, when its population was nearly entirely white, and bigots who had a problem with that should find a state where the minority population is 1% or whatever. It's not that in Minnesota. It's not going to be again. Mr. Trump's message a year later was that it could be that again. If elected, he promised that his administration would not admit any refugees without the support of the local community where they are being placed, the least they could do for you. You've suffered enough in Minnesota. The speech crystallized one of the core themes of Mr. Trump's politics, which has become the overwhelming argument of his second term, that the country's foundational idea of a civic nation, one whose people are bound by a shared commitment to principles rather than ancestry or cultural identity, is a sort of liberal swindle. In Mr. Trump's America, Shared prosperity requires exclusion, a policing by force if necessary, of the boundaries of who gets to call themselves American, based in large part on where they come from. It is both fitting and not incidental that this agenda has been made so visible this month in Minneapolis, where immigration agents shot a woman dead, and in recent days fired tear gas and smoke grenades at protesters on residential streets. On Wednesday, after a top Justice Department official declared Minnesota's resistance to the federal deployment an insurrection on social media, Mr. Waltz posted on X that his state will remain an island of decency, of justice, of community, and of peace. His statement made clear how the state government and many of its citizens see this conflict. Generalizing about any state's political temperament is impossible in 2026, when practically all of them, including Minnesota, have variations on the same map of highly polarized rural reds and urban blues. Rural Minnesotans who support for Democrats has collapsed in recent years likely have a far different view than Minneapolitans do of Mr. Trump's deployment. Nevertheless, Minnesota is still a Democratic stronghold in presidential elections, and for over half a century, it has more clearly than perhaps any other state embodied the civic ideal that Mr. Trump seems intent on overturning. On the ground in Minneapolis, there is very overtly what the city's residents who are tracking and confronting federal agents see themselves fighting for. Still, the largely unified local response to the flood of federal forces into Minneapolis is remarkable in light of the city's very recent history, which has involved a deep soul-searching about precisely that ideal. In 2022, Lance Moreau, a former Time magazine writer and fellow at the Conservative Ethics and Public Policy Center, wrote a column for the Wall Street Journal titled "How Minnesota Went from Tom Sawyer to Huck Finn." Surveying Minneapolis's grim crime statistics in the wake of the rioting and prolonged malaise that had followed Mr. Floyd's murder, a near-record number of homicides, a 537% year-over-year increase in carjackings, Mr. Moreau proclaimed the state to be a microcosm of an America in crisis. Less than 2 years after the protests after Mr. Floyd's killing, this was hardly an uncommon argument. But coming from Mr. Moreau, it carried an unusual sting. In 1973, he had written the Your text of Minnesotan exceptionalism, a story in Time called Minnesota, a State That Works. Touring Minneapolis and its suburbs, Mr. Moreau had covered the 1967 riots in Detroit and the Vietnam War, seemed genuinely in awe of how little Minnesota appeared to have been touched by the traumas and upheavals racking the country. It is a state where a residual American secret still seems to operate, he wrote, surveying Minnesota's wonders one by one. A thriving and diversified economy, the lowest high school dropout rate in the country, and the third lowest crime rate per capita, incomes above the national average, an abundance of outdoor recreational opportunities that its unnervingly hale residents flock to. The cover of the issue featured Wendell Anderson, the state's handsome young governor, on a lake in a plaid shirt, beaming over a freshly caught northern pike. But mostly, Mr. Moreau was struck by the extraordinary civic interest of Minnesotans. Citizens' lobbies thrived. Minnesota-based companies voluntarily ponied up millions of dollars to improve downtown Minneapolis and build the Mayo Clinic. Voters cheerfully accepted statewide tax increases to better fund underserved local school districts. The state's elected officials seemed to be starry-eyed idealists motivated by a genuine commitment to service and little expectation of reward. Daniel J. Alazar, the Minneapolis-born political scientist and scholar of American federalism, described Minnesota as a moralistic political culture, one of three such cultures he identified, along with the individualistic and traditionalistic. The moralistic strain in American public life, in Alazar's definition, saw politics as a noble pursuit, one that did not just guard liberty or identity, or pursue interests, but could be a tool for actively improving people's lives. In Minnesota, Mr. Alazar argued, embodied the moralistic culture more so than any other in the Union or perhaps in the world. This owed something to his history. The state's civil society was shaped in the 19th century by Yankee anti-slavery Republicans and later immigrants from Scandinavia and Germany, all deeply moralistic political cultures and something to politics. The most powerful force in Minnesota politics for decades has been the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, a mid-century left-liberal fusion organization shaped in its early years by a cohort of cerebral amateurs, several of them young political science professors. The DFL, in its early history, was particularly preoccupied with race relations. Hubert H. Humphrey, one of the party's founders, led the campaign to insert the civil rights plank into the National Party platform at the 1948 Democratic National Convention, prompting the Dixiecrat walkout and the realignment of American partisan politics that followed. The fact that this commitment existed in one of the least diverse states in the country, as recently as 1980, Minnesota was 96.7% white, seemed to Minnesota liberals a further testament to the state's exceptionalism. But as race has become a ubiquitous lens for social science analysis, Minnesota has come in for a harder look. For a quarter century now, researchers drawing on data from around the world have noted a clear correlation between the generosity of a country's welfare state and the homogeneity of its population, a finding that invites a new reading of the idea of moralistic government as just another form of self-interest. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Sunday, January 18th, 2026 issue of the front section of the New York Times. We read from the front section of the New York Times every Sunday at 1 p.m. Your reader has been Julian Wong. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the New York Times opinion page. Following that at 3 o'clock, the New York Times Arts and Leisure, and at 4 o'clock, a rebroadcast of this morning's Buffalo News. Radio Reading mails out a large print program schedule to our listeners every other month. If you have not received a Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service large print program schedule in the mail, please call us at 716-821-5555. We will make sure that you receive one every other month. A Braille version of the schedule is also available upon request. Our number again is 716-821-5555. following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision,